It was a busy afternoon at the Westwood Mall. Shoppers strolled from store to store, their hands full of bags, their faces lit with excitement. Inside Luxwear, a high-end clothing boutique, the atmosphere was different. The store was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the polished floors and designer shelves whispered an unspoken rule. This place was only for a certain kind of customer. A man stepped inside, his confident posture radiating calmness. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a neatly pressed button-up, and clean sneakers. He walked with a relaxed ease, scanning the racks of expensive suits and polished leather shoes. But as soon as he entered, a salesman behind the counter straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "Can I help you?" the salesman asked, his tone more skeptical than welcoming. The man offered a polite nod. "Just browsing." The salesman's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked the man up and down, his gaze lingering on his sneakers, then at his face, as if trying to assess whether he belonged here. His expression shifted from curiosity to disapproval. "These clothes are quite expensive," the salesman said, stepping around the counter. "Might not be what you're looking for." The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly do you think I'm looking for?" The salesman let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Look, we have stores downstairs with more affordable options. This place isn't exactly budget-friendly, if you know what I mean." A few other customers glanced over, sensing the tension. The man inhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He took a step closer to the nearest rack, running his fingers over the fabric of a tailored suit. "I like this one," he said, ignoring the salesman's comment. "How much?" The salesman smirked. "That one. That's a designer piece. Over $2,000. The man nodded, as if considering the price. He reached for the tag but didn't flinch at the number. The salesman, however, wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Listen, I don't mean to be rude," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But we have to be careful about letting people handle the merchandise. You understand, right?" The man's fingers paused on the fabric. A brief silence stretched between them. The air in the store felt heavier now. Customers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the salesman's words carried a deeper meaning. The man exhaled softly, as if weighing his next move. Then he turned to fully face the salesman, his gaze steady. "That's interesting," he said, his voice calm. "Because I actually own this store." For a moment the salesman didn't react. It was as if the words hadn't registered. Then his smirk faltered. His confident stance wavered. The store had gone completely silent. The man tilted his head slightly, studying the salesman's face. "So, tell me again," he said, his voice still even, still controlled. "Why exactly I don't belong here?" The salesman's face turned pale, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. The other customers in the store were watching now, their curiosity turning into quiet shock. The man, the one the salesman had just insulted, stood firm, waiting. His calm expression never wavered, but there was something about his presence that demanded respect. He wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting, but the weight of his words hung in the air, making the salesman shift uncomfortably. The salesman stammered, swallowing hard. "I didn't mean." The man raised a hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. "No need to explain," he said. "I already understand." The salesman's face flushed red. He knew he had made a huge mistake, but there was no way to take it back now. He had assumed. And now, standing in front of the very person who had the power to decide his future, he didn't know what to say. A woman near the fitting rooms exchanged a glance with another customer, her eyebrows raised. A young couple whispered quietly, their eyes darting between the two men. The air felt thick with tension. The man who owned the store looked around, taking in the moment. His gaze moved from the other customers to the polished marble floors, the neatly arranged racks, and then back to the salesman. He had built this place from the ground up. He had put in years of hard work, making sure Lux, where wasn't just a store but a brand people respected. And yet, here he was, being told he didn't belong in his own creation. He let out a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. "Tell me something," he said, his voice steady. "How long have you worked here?" The salesman blinked, still struggling to regain control of the situation. "A few months," he answered quickly. The man nodded. "And in those few months, have you always judged people based on what they wear?" The salesman opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at the other customers, as if searching for support, but found none. Everyone was waiting for his answer. "No, of course not," he finally said. I thought." The man raised an eyebrow. "You thought what?" The salesman looked down, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought you might be in the wrong store," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The man gave a small nod, as if he had expected that response. "And what made you think that?" The salesman hesitated. He knew he couldn't answer truthfully without making things worse, but lying wouldn't help either. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. The silence stretched too long. The man watched him for another moment before finally speaking again. "Do you know how this store was built?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The salesman blinked in confusion. "What? This store?" the man repeated. "Do you know how it came to be?" The salesman shook his head slowly. "No, I guess not." The man exhaled and glanced around the store again, as if seeing it from a different perspective. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "Luxwear didn't just appear overnight. It started as a small idea. A dream, really. I spent years working for other companies, learning the industry. I put in late nights, early mornings. I saved every dollar I could. I invested everything I had into this place." The salesman swallowed hard. His eyes locked on the man in front of him. "I had doors shut in my face," the man continued. "People told me I wouldn't make it, that someone like me couldn't build something like this. But I kept going, kept pushing, and eventually I made it happen." A few customers shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his words. The salesman stayed silent, his hands fidgeting at his sides. The man's gaze locked onto him again. "So when I walk into my own store and someone tells me I don't belong here?" He let the words hang for a moment. "You can understand why that's a problem." The salesman's throat tightened. The man shook his head slightly. "Don't apologize." "Not yet." The salesman blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The man tilted his head. "Apologies are easy," he said. "They're just words. But understanding, that's different." The salesman looked down, shame creeping into his expression. He had been so sure of himself earlier, so quick to judge. Now standing here he felt small. The other customers remained quiet, absorbing the moment. The tension in the store hadn't lifted, it had only deepened. The man took a step back, still watching the salesman closely. "Tell me," he said, "what would you have done if I was just another customer?" The salesman hesitated. I don't know." The man nodded slowly. "That's the problem." For the first time, the salesman realized the real weight of his mistake. It wasn't just about misjudging one person, it was about how many others he had misjudged before. How many customers had walked into this store and felt unwelcome? How many had left because of people like him? His stomach twisted at the thought. The man studied his face for a moment longer, then turned slightly, glancing toward the back of the store where the manager's office was. The salesman felt his heart race. Was he about to be fired? Was this it for him? The man sighed softly. "I'm not going to decide your fate," he said finally. "But someone else will." The salesman's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The man looked past him. "Your manager," he said simply. "We'll see if you really belong here." The salesman turned quickly, his face paling even more as he saw his manager stepping out of the office. The expression on the manager's face said it all. He had been watching. And now, the decision wasn't in the salesman's hands anymore. The manager, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit, walked toward them with a slow, deliberate pace. His sharp eyes moved between the salesman and the man who had just revealed himself as the owner. The silence in the store felt even heavier now, like the air itself had thickened with tension. The salesman shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching by his side. He wanted to speak, to defend himself somehow, but he knew there was no excuse that would make this situation any better. His manager's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made the salesman's stomach churn. The owner turned slightly, acknowledging the manager with a small nod. "Looks like you've been watching," he said, his voice still calm but firm. The manager cleared his throat. "I have," he admitted. His tone was careful, measured, as if he were choosing his words with great precision. The salesman swallowed hard. He had never been nervous around his manager before, but now he felt like a schoolboy waiting for a lecture. He could already imagine what was coming, a public reprimand, maybe even termination. His mind raced through possible ways to salvage this, but deep down, he knew there was nothing to fix. The manager turned to the owner. "I'd like to apologize on behalf of the store," he said smoothly. "This is not how we conduct business here." The owner's expression remained neutral. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I'm not looking for a company statement. I want to know what happens next." The manager hesitated. He glanced at the salesman who stood frozen, his face tight with regret. The silence stretched again, making the moment even more unbearable. "I take full responsibility," the salesman said suddenly, his voice slightly shaky. I shouldn't have judged you. I made an assumption and it was wrong." The owner studied him for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "Why?" The salesman frowned slightly. "Why what? Why did you assume?" the owner asked. His voice wasn't accusing, just steady and direct. The salesman hesitated, looking down. His mind scrambled for the right answer, but the truth was uncomfortable. He had worked in retail long enough to develop a habit of sizing people up, deciding in seconds whether they were real customers or just wasting time. But that wasn't an answer he could say out loud, not now. "I don't know," he finally muttered, though he knew it wasn't the full truth. The owner let the words hang for a moment before shaking his head slightly. "That's not good enough." The salesman clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of those words. He had spent years in this business, climbing his way up from a part-time associate to a lead salesman. He thought he understood people. He thought he knew how to read a customer. But in this moment, standing in front of the very man who built the place he worked in, he realized how badly he had miscalculated. The manager shifted slightly. "I think we should take this conversation to the office," he suggested. His voice was polite, but there was no mistaking the underlying authority. The owner nodded but didn't move right away. Instead, he turned back to the salesman. "You're coming too." The salesman felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. This was worse than he had thought. His feet felt heavy as he followed them toward the back of the store, his mind racing with what might happen next. As they passed through the sleek glass doors leading to the employee area, the murmurs of customers behind them faded. The showroom's bright lighting was replaced by the dimmer, more sterile atmosphere of the back office. The hallway smelled of fresh paper and faint traces of coffee, but none of it provided any comfort. Inside the office, the manager gestured for them to sit. The salesman hesitated before lowering himself into the chair, his palms slightly sweaty. The owner didn't sit right away. Instead, he leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "Tell me about your hiring process," he said, looking at the manager. The manager straightened in his seat. "We have a structured system. Applicants go through an interview process, and we train them on customer service, company policies, and do you train them on how to treat people? The owner interrupted. The manager hesitated. We expect professionalism from all employees. The owner let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Professionalism, he repeated. And does professionalism include judging customers based on appearance? The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again. He knew this wasn't a simple question with an easy answer. The owner turned his gaze back to the salesman. I don't think you're a bad person, he said. But today you made someone feel like they didn't belong. And the worst part, you didn't even realize it. The words hit hard. The salesman shifted in his seat, his throat tightening. He had prided himself on his ability to sell, to connect with customers, to make them feel valued. But in one careless moment, he had done the exact opposite. The owner exhaled, his expression unreadable. So now the question is, what do we do about it? The salesman's heart pounded. Are you firing me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The owner didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied him for a long moment before saying, What do you think should happen? The salesman hesitated. He wanted to beg for his job, to explain that he could do better, that he had learned his lesson. But somehow those words felt weak. I don't know, he admitted finally. But I know I messed up. The owner nodded, as if waiting for him to say more. The salesman swallowed hard. I don't want to lose this job, he said honestly. But I also don't want to be the kind of person who makes customers feel the way I made you feel. For the first time, something in the owner's expression softened just slightly. He pushed himself off the desk, straightening his posture. Good, he said simply. Because whether or not you stay isn't up to me. The salesman frowned. What do you mean? The owner turned to the manager. I'm not here to make an example out of anyone. I built this store on respect, for customers and employees alike. If he's going to stay, I need to know that he's willing to do better. That's not my call to make. The salesman's eyes darted to his manager, who was watching the situation unfold carefully. You have a choice, the owner continued. You can walk away, or you can prove that you deserve to be here. The room went silent. The salesman felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He hadn't been fired, not yet, but the real test had just begun. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The salesman's throat felt dry. His pulse pounded in his ears as he sat frozen in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The store's owner had put the decision in someone else's hands, but that didn't make it any easier. Every second that passed felt longer than the last. The manager leaned forward slightly, his fingers laced together on the desk. He had always been strict but fair, the kind of boss who expected results but rarely showed emotion. Right now, though, there was something unreadable in his eyes, something the salesman couldn't decipher. You said you don't want to be the kind of person who makes customers feel unwelcome, the manager said finally. His tone was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. What are you going to do about it? The salesman's hands gripped the edges of his chair. He wasn't sure what answer they wanted. Was he supposed to promise never to judge a customer again? Say he had learned his lesson? Words felt useless now. He had already apologized, but somehow that didn't seem like enough. I want to make it right, he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before. The owner tilted his head slightly. And how do you plan to do that? The salesman hesitated. He wasn't sure what they expected, but he knew one thing. He couldn't undo what had happened. He had treated the owner unfairly. And if the owner hadn't spoken up, if he had been just another customer, that judgment might have driven him away. I don't know, the salesman admitted. But I know I need to change how I see people. I got so used to assuming things about customers that I didn't stop to think about how that affects them. The manager exchanged a glance with the owner, then let out a slow breath. You've been a good salesman, he said. But today you weren't just selling clothes. You were selling the idea that some people don't belong here. The words hit like a punch to the gut. The salesman had always thought of himself as someone who could read people, someone who knew how to connect. But now he realized that those so-called instincts had been built on something else, something he didn't like admitting. A long silence stretched between them. The owner remained standing, his expression unreadable. The manager tapped his fingers lightly against the desk, as if thinking through his next words. Finally the manager spoke again. There's only one way to prove you deserve to be here. The salesman swallowed. How? The manager nodded toward the showroom. Go back out there. And this time do your job right. The salesman blinked in surprise. He had expected something worse, a long lecture, maybe even being fired on the spot. Instead, they were giving him a chance to prove himself. But there was a catch. He wasn't just walking back onto the sales floor as an employee. He was walking back into the same space where he had humiliated the owner, where customers had overheard his words and seen his actions. And now, all eyes would be on him. A cold weight settled in his stomach. He could already imagine the whispers, the judgment. The other employees had seen what happened. Some of them probably thought he didn't deserve another chance. Maybe they were right. The owner studied him closely, as if reading every thought running through his mind. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about growth. You want to be better. Show us. The salesman took a slow breath. His palms were still clammy, his heartbeat still fast, but he gave a small nod. Without another word, the owner stepped back, gesturing toward the door. The message was clear. It was time to face the consequences of his actions. The salesman rose to his feet, his legs feeling heavier than before. He forced himself to walk step by step back toward the sales floor. Each step felt harder than the last. As he pushed through the employee door and stepped into the bright lights of the showroom, he immediately felt the shift in energy. The quiet murmurs, the sideways glances. The customers who had seen everything earlier were still there, their eyes lingering on him for just a moment too long. One of the other sales associates, a woman named Lisa, looked up from where she was folding shirts. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes held something else. Test. He knew what she was thinking. Let's see if you've really learned anything. The salesman inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He wasn't sure how to fix what he had done, but there was only one way to start. Just then, the bell above the door chimed, signaling a new customer entering the store. The salesman turned, and his heart clenched. An older man had just walked in, dressed in worn-out jeans and a faded jacket. He moved slowly, taking in the expensive displays with careful eyes. His shoes were scuffed, his hands rough and calloused. The salesman saw the way the other employees shifted slightly, waiting to see what he would do. And in that moment he realized this was it. The real test had begun. The salesman felt the weight of every gaze in the store. His co-workers, the customers, even the owner. They were all watching, waiting to see if he had truly changed. The older man who had just walked in seemed unaware of the tension lingering in the air. He moved slowly, taking in the high-end displays with quiet curiosity. His worn-out clothes and tired posture made him stand out among the polished, well-dressed shoppers. The salesman took a deep breath. This was his chance, but it wasn't just about proving something to the owner or his manager. It was about proving something to himself. Without hesitating, he stepped forward. "Welcome in, sir," he said with a warm smile. His voice was steady, professional, but genuine. "Is there anything I can help you find today?" The older man looked up, surprised. His weathered face carried deep lines, his gray eyes sharp yet cautious. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he gave a small nod. "Just looking," he said, his voice rough but polite. The salesman nodded back. "Take your time. Let me know if you have any questions." The man turned back to the displays, but the salesman didn't walk away. Something about him felt different from the usual customers who browsed without buying. His hands hovered over the fabrics, his fingers brushing the material as if feeling their quality, yet there was hesitation in his movements. "You looking for something special?" the salesman asked, keeping his tone light. The man hesitated, glancing at him again. He seemed to weigh his words before speaking. "Actually, yeah," he admitted. "I need a suit." The salesman nodded, relieved to have a direction. "Any particular occasion?" The man's fingers twitched slightly against the fabric of a dark navy blazer. "A job interview," he said after a pause. That caught the salesman off guard. He had assumed, maybe unfairly, that this man had no real intention to buy. But now, looking at him again, he saw something else. Determination, maybe even a little nervousness. "What kind of job?" the salesman asked, keeping the conversation going. The older man let out a breath. "Security," he said. "At a company downtown." He hesitated before adding, "Been out of work for a while. Just trying to get back on my feet." The salesman felt something shift inside him. Just hours ago, he had judged the store's owner without knowing his story. And now, here he was, facing someone he might have dismissed in the past. But this wasn't just another customer. This was someone who needed help. "Well," the salesman said, stepping to the side, "let's find you something that'll make the right impression." The older man blinked, as if surprised by the offer. "You don't have to," he said quickly. "I'm not looking for anything too expensive. Just something decent." The salesman ignored that. "Don't worry about that part," he said, leading the man toward the suits. "Let's just find what fits you best." As he started pulling options, he noticed Lisa, the other sales associate, watching him from a few feet away. Her expression had softened slightly, as if acknowledging his effort. He felt a small sense of relief, but the real test wasn't over yet. The older man ran his hand over the sleeve of a sleek charcoal suit. "This one's nice," he murmured, almost to himself. "It'd look great on you," the salesman said. "Let's get you measured." As he grabbed a measuring tape, he heard a voice behind him, one that made his stomach drop. "Are you sure he can afford that?" The words weren't his. They came from a different salesman, a younger guy named Greg, who had been standing nearby. His tone was casual, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that made the air grow tense. The older man stiffened. His fingers slowly withdrew from the fabric, his posture shifting. The salesman felt something hot rise in his chest. Just moments ago, he had been in Greg's position, making silent assumptions about customers. And now, hearing it out loud, he realized how ugly it sounded. Before he could speak, the store owner, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "I don't recall asking about your opinion on our customers, Greg." Greg turned startled. "I just meant..." The owner didn't let him finish. "I know exactly what you meant," he said smoothly. Then he glanced at the salesman. "Continue helping your customer." The salesman nodded, forcing himself to refocus. He turned back to the older man. "Let's try on that suit," he said gently, as if nothing had happened. But he could still see the doubt in the man's eyes. And suddenly the stakes felt even higher. Because now, it wasn't just about proving himself to the owner or his coworkers. It was about making sure this man walked out of the store feeling like he belonged. The older man stood still for a moment, his fingers lightly brushing the sleeve of the suit he had admired earlier. There was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of self-doubt, as if Greg's words had left an invisible mark. The salesman could see it clearly. He had almost lost him. But not this time. "Let's get you into the fitting room," the salesman said, keeping his voice steady, reassuring. He reached for the charcoal suit and handed it to the man, meeting his gaze directly. "I think this one's going to be perfect." The older man hesitated, then gave a small nod. He took the suit and walked toward the fitting rooms, his steps slow but steady. The salesman exhaled quietly, only now realizing how tense his shoulders had become. From the corner of his eye, He noticed the store owner watching him closely. There was something unreadable in his expression, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded, a subtle acknowledgement that the salesman was handling this moment the right way. Minutes later, the fitting room door creaked open. The older man stepped out, standing in front of the mirror. The transformation was striking. The suit fit him well, the clean lines giving him a sharp, confident look. But more than that, something had changed in his posture. The hesitation from before had faded. He turned slightly, studying his reflection with a quiet kind of awe. "I've never worn anything this nice before," he admitted. His voice almost reluctant, as if saying it out loud made it feel too real. The salesman smiled. "Well, you should. It suits you." The older man ran a hand over the fabric, then exhaled. "I appreciate the help, son, but I don't think I can afford this." The words were expected, but they still hit hard. Before the salesman could respond, the store owner spoke up from behind them. "Consider it taken care of." Both the salesman and the older man turned in surprise. The owner stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "You've got a job interview coming up. You need to walk into that room feeling like you belong there." He paused. "This suit isn't just fabric. It's the confidence you'll carry with you." The older man blinked, clearly caught off guard. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped himself. Instead, he looked at the owner, studying him for a long moment. "I don't take charity," he said quietly. The owner nodded, as if he expected that response. "Then don't. Think of it as an investment, one professional helping another get back on his feet." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, after what felt like forever, the older man nodded. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he extended his hand. The owner shook it firmly. "Thank you," the older man said, his voice filled with something deeper than gratitude. As he changed back into his old clothes, the salesman felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about selling anymore. It never had been. When the older man returned, suit in hand, he turned to the salesman. "You treated me with respect," he said. "That means more than you know." The salesman swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. "You deserve it." The older man gave a final nod before walking toward the exit. But just before he reached the door, he paused. Then, with a small smile, he said, "By the way, I used to run a security team for corporate offices." He glanced at the store owner. "If you ever need someone to keep an eye on things, I know a guy." The store owner smiled. "I just might take you up on that." And with that, the man walked out, his head held high, carrying more than just a suit. He carried a second chance. As the door swung shut behind him, the salesman let out a slow breath. He turned to see the store owner watching him once again. "You did good today," the owner said. The salesman nodded, feeling a mix of relief and something else, something lighter. And then, just as he thought the moment had settled, the owner spoke again. "Oh, and one more thing," he added casually. "You're getting a raise." The salesman's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" The owner smirked. "You learned a lesson today. But more importantly, you proved you could grow." The salesman was speechless. Just hours ago he had nearly lost everything. And now he had earned something even greater than a paycheck. He had earned trust. As he turned back to the sales floor, he saw Greg watching him, his expression unreadable. But the salesman didn't care. Because for the first time he wasn't just selling clothes. He was selling something far more important. Dignity, respect. And that was priceless. The salesman stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Raise. It wasn't just about the money, though that was definitely a bonus. It was about what it meant. He had spent the entire day proving himself, not just to the store owner but to himself. And somehow, in the middle of it all, he had changed. He looked around the store, seeing it differently now. It wasn't just a place to sell expensive clothes. It was a place where people walked in carrying their own struggles, their own stories. Some were just browsing, some were searching for something more. He had been too blind to see it before, too focused on judgments that never mattered. Greg, still standing a few feet away, scoffed under his breath. Guess sucking up to the right people pays off. The salesman turned to him, but unlike before, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel the need to defend himself. Instead, he just smiled. Or maybe treating people right does. Greg rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath before walking away. But the salesman didn't let it bother him. He had once thought like Greg, thinking success came from putting yourself above others. But today had proved otherwise. Lisa, the other sales associate, walked over, crossing her arms. "Not bad," she said, tilting her head toward the door where the older man had left. "You handled that well." "Thanks," he said. She studied him for a moment, then smirked. "Don't let it get to your head." He chuckled. "No promises." The rest of the shift passed by in a blur. He helped customers, but this time he really saw them. When a nervous young man came in looking for a suit for his first job, he took the time to guide him through options. When an older woman hesitated over a purchase, he reassured her she was making the right choice. Every interaction felt different, more personal. By the time closing came around, he felt exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, it was the kind of exhaustion that felt good. As he grabbed his coat and headed for the door, the store owner called out, "Hey!" The salesman turned. The owner walked over, his usual composed expression still in place, but there was a hint of something softer beneath it. "I don't give second chances lightly," he said. "I know. But I also believe in giving people room to grow." The salesman nodded. "I appreciate that." The owner glanced toward the glass doors, where the city lights flickered outside. "That man today, he reminded me of someone." The salesman frowned slightly. "Who?" The owner's gaze remained on the door. "Me," he said simply. The words hit harder than expected. The salesman had assumed the owner had always been successful, that he had always belonged in places like this. But now, looking at him, he saw something else, something deeper. "I used to be the guy walking into stores like this, feeling out of place," the owner continued. "People looked at me like I didn't belong. Like I wasn't worth their time." He turned back to the salesman. "It stays with you." The salesman swallowed. He had never thought about it that way before. The owner let out a breath. "That's why I was watching you today. I needed to know if you'd get it. If you'd understand." The salesman held his gaze. "I do now." The owner gave a small nod, then patted him on the shoulder. "Good. Now don't forget it." With that, he walked off, leaving the salesman standing there, the weight of the day settling over him. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he found himself thinking back to the older man who had left with his new suit. He hoped the job interview would go well. He hoped the man would walk into that office with confidence, knowing he belonged. And maybe, just maybe, he hoped that he himself had finally found where he belonged too. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about selling clothes. It was about something bigger. It was about respect, about second chances, about seeing people for who they really were. And that was the real lesson.